Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm your coach, Tami Stackelhouse, and this is episode 111. In today's episode, I'm interviewing Dr. Chelsea Liebowitz about insurance enrollment and utilization. Working with clients, I get a lot of questions from people who are trying to understand their insurance coverage. Today, Dr. Liebowitz will cover things like what's a deductible? What's a MOOP or an out-of-pocket maximum? Coinsurance, copays, prior authorizations, and lots more. She is even going to share some tips on how you can increase your odds at having certain medications and procedures approved by your insurance company. If you have found yourself confused and overwhelmed by all the insurance options, this episode is for you. While this episode is focused on the U.S. healthcare system, many of the ideas and concepts could apply to other countries and other healthcare options. Now, let me introduce you to today's guest. Dr. Chelsea Liebowitz grew up in Farmington Hills, Michigan, where she endured her fair share of chronic illness. Despite constantly feeling ill, she was determined to find answers, and so she went to the University of Michigan in search of them. 3 degrees later, the answer wasn't found in school classrooms. It was found when she learned to trust herself. Chelsea now coaches other patients with chronic jaw pain and has a vision to upgrade the healthcare system to provide better service to those struggling with chronic pain. She is the author of TMJ is Ruining My Life, Managing Jaw Pain So You Can Eat Normally, and Life with a Service Dog, Make an Informed Decision to Get a Psychiatric Service Dog. We will have links to Dr. Chelsea's books on today's show notes page at fibromyalgiapodcast.com/111 for 111. Of course, I want to remind you that the information that we share in this podcast is not meant to be considered medical or insurance advice, nor is it intended to replace consulting with a qualified insurance broker, physician, or other healthcare provider. Dr. Chelsea is, of course, sharing from her personal knowledge and expertise. If you are interested in hearing more from Dr. Chelsea, including her personal experience with chronic pain, I would recommend checking out our prior interview in episode 92. It's at fibromyalgiapodcast.com/92, where Dr. Chelsea talks about addiction, dependence, withdrawal, all those things related to medications. That discussion that we had was really quite interesting and enlightening. So I encourage you to check out episode 92 as well. Now, here is my interview with Dr. Chelsea Liebowitz. Hi, Chelsea. Welcome. Thank you for being a repeat guest on the podcast.
Hi, Tami. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Now, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, I introduced you separately, but it doesn't really talk about why you're here doing this talk today. So I was wondering if you would just kind of fill us in a little bit on some of the other things that you do involving insurance and why you know what you know.
Yeah, so I went to college for pharmacy. I'm a doctor of pharmacy. And in my day job, I work for an insurance company and I do prior authorizations. I'm usually the person making those determinations and helping with self-funded plans.
Awesome. Awesome. So we've got all the questions for you on insurance today.
Yeah.
Our goal, as you and I talked about, is really to empower the people who are listening as we come into that open enrollment time where people are choosing their different insurance options to make sure they get the right options for them. So
Yes.
let's start with just some definitions. And I guess we should probably start with the one that I just said, open enrollment.
Yeah. So open enrollment is basically the time when your employer decides that you can pick your plan. You can usually pick your plan once a year, unless you have some qualifying events, which is I don't know, like you lost your job would be a qualifying event or some other big thing, but usually they require that you must wait till open enrollment to pick the plan. If you have a spouse or a family member, you can also add them at the open enrollment time. Most common one is 1/1, January 1, when that's when like the marketplace for healthcare, kind of Obamacare starts is 1/1. But a lot of employers have different start times. I know mine is August 1st is our date. So right now is our open enrollment period. And it really just changes depending on the employer and when they're changing their plan.
Awesome. And I know for us, it can be different everywhere you are and every person you work for.
Yes.
So for Scott's work, it's in the fall is when open enrollment is. I forget when the exact deadline is, but we're always choosing things in like September, October. So
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing, is to know when your open enrollment is.
Mhm.
And that may be different than when your insurance benefits start and restart,
Yes.
right? Because you have to
Yes.
enroll before it can go into effect and so on and so forth.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Awesome. So
Yeah.
some of the other terms that we hear thrown around a lot are things like deductible, out-of-pocket max, copay, co-insurance. Let's
Mhm.
just run down through some of those.
All right. So deductible is the amount of money that you're going to pay before some other benefits kick in. So you always say, your copay might be, we're going to cover your 100% of your copay after you meet your deductible. So that's always a big number that we want to look at right away, because that's basically what you're going to be paying up front on top of your premiums. So your premiums don't apply to deductible, and the deductible can be anywhere from $1,500 to $8,000, and that's really going to be dependent on the plan and the options. So on top of your deductible is your maximum out of pocket. I call it the MOOP. So your MOOP is basically saying that once you meet that amount of money, the insurance covers everything and you have a $0 copay on everything. Even if you have like $100 copay, once you meet your MOOP, your maximum out of pocket, it will be $0. So your MOOP is on top of your deductible. So if your deductible is $2,000, your maximum out of pocket could be $4,000. And that means you're going to pay your $2,000 in your deductible. And then that second $2,000 is going to be through copays, through office visits. And you usually don't really meet it that often. It's very kind of rare to meet your maximum out of pocket, but it is possible depending on the plan. And so those are two numbers that essentially, when you pick your plan, you should be willing to pay all of that money over the year. The insurance does pick up things, but until you're going to pay $0 and they cover every single thing, you have to meet both your deductible and your maximum out of pocket.
And the insurance premiums, it's like a seesaw with your deductible, right? The more
Yes.
you pay per month, usually the lower your deductible is, because you're still paying that. You're just paying it in your deductible as opposed to when you utilize your healthcare.
Yes. So the premiums, right, like you said, the more expensive your premiums, probably the lower your deductible. And you're most of the plans, you kind of are paying the same general amount. It's dependent on when you're going to pay it and how you're going to pay it. So some plans have a lower deductible maybe, or they don't have a limit, and then you could literally get hospitalized and have to pay your entire maximum out of pocket up front before they kick in anything. Versus maybe you pick a higher premium, they have a lower maximum out of pocket, and they'll limit that amount. So that way, if you were to go into a hospital, you would have a maximum, you would only pay $3,000 out of pocket. Insurance would pick everything up. So it really, like you said, it's a seesaw. You have your premium, your deductible. These are
Mhm.
all numbers to consider. Most of the time, employers try to make them pretty similar.
And another word we've been using is like copays.
Mhm.
And sometimes people will also hear co-insurance. And those are
Yes.
two different things. So let's talk about
Yes.
those.
So the best way to talk about copays is to think about when you go to pick up a medication from the pharmacy, a prescription. When you go there and they say your copay is $10, that means you paid $10 and the insurance paid the rest of it. Sometimes the drug is only $15 and you pay $10. Sometimes the drug is $5,000 and you pay $10. So that's your copay, and it's pretty a standard number. It's going to be the same all of the time. Co-insurance, on the other hand, is usually a percentage. So you could have a co-insurance type copay where every drug that you get, you pay 20% of the cost. Co-insurance really comes up with doctor visits sometimes, or like any procedures, sometimes like lab testing, diagnosis, imaging. They'll have like a 20% co-insurance, which is you pay 20%, the insurance pays the rest until you meet your maximum out of pocket, and then the insurance pays everything.
Right. So putting all these pictures together, let's say that we need to go get an x-ray, and just for super easy math, let's say it's $100. It's not going to be
Mhm.
$100, but
No, it's gonna be way more than that.
but for easy math, let's just say it's
Right.
$100. So your deductible, if you have a $500, $1,500 deductible, and you haven't met that yet, you're paying the full $100
Mhm.
because you haven't met your deductible yet,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
And then if you were to have let's say a $25 copay,
Mhm.
that means anytime you go get an x-ray, it's $25, then your $100 x-ray is $25,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
And then if you've met your deductible and you're in that co-insurance part of things,
Mhm.
then let's say it's 80/20, where insurance
Mhm.
pays 80%, you pay 20%, then your $100 x-ray is $20.
Yes.
And then the final scenario, if you have met your out-of-pocket maximum, your MOOP,
Mhm.
I
Yep.
love that, then you don't pay anything for your $100 because you've already paid the maximum amount that you can pay in a year.
Yes, that's about sums it up.
So, for you listening, you can see why this is confusing. Because there's
100%.
so many different ways it could go depending on where you're at with your deductible, your out of pocket, all of those things.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so what I would say is your HR. So I'm speaking to the person who has an employer, right? You can also go to a marketplace, but I'm just going to go to employer because I feel like a lot of people have that. Either you or your spouse is getting it through your employer. They will give you an SBC, or a summary of benefits coverage. And it will lay all of this out there. Does it make it any less confusing? No. But it is written down so you can kind of try to figure it out. And usually your HR person can really help, or they have, like, your HR person has a rep who you can talk to and just say, hey, how much would it be to get an x-ray on this plan? I get every 3 months x-rays to check on something. How much would it be? And the representatives, the HR, are there to help you and ask the questions.
Hmm. And I think the other thing really to realize with all of this is that there isn't necessarily a good plan or a bad plan. It really depends on how you utilize healthcare, right?
Yes.
If you're listening to this, you have fibromyalgia, probably, right? And so
Yes.
you are utilizing healthcare more than the average
Yes.
person. So maybe it makes more sense for you to have a lower deductible and out-of-pocket maximum, or maybe not, depending on what it is that you utilize. What about things like covered expenses and things that aren't covered? So, like, for instance, my husband has hearing aids. On
Mhm.
some plans, hearing aids have been covered, and some plans that they're not.
Yes. So usually in that SBC, it will say at some point, hearing aids not covered, weight loss agents not covered, chiropractic covered. You might have to ask for those benefits. One thing I did want to bring up too is an HMO versus a PPO.
Oh,
And this is
yes.
really important for people with fibromyalgia. If you have an HMO, you're going to be required to have a primary care doctor, and to go to any specialist, you're going to need a referral. It's usually only in state. It's a very limited plan. Personally, I would not recommend it for someone who has fibromyalgia. I would go for the PPO, preferred provider something. I don't know. They have weird names. But basically what it means is that as long as your provider is in network, then you can go to any provider. You don't need a referral to see a specialist. And this is really good because sometimes I've heard horror stories of patients having a primary care who tries to gatekeep you from seeing a rheumatologist, an allergist. They just say, oh, I don't think you need that. I don't really believe you. And now you're stuck because you can't go see the doctor you want. So PPO, if you have a chronic illness, is definitely the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
What this looks like sometimes, and you can see in the SBC, is we'll say in network, out of network, or we'll say not covered. So usually when it's out of network, it's not covered. So that means if you have an HMO and your primary care does not send you a referral, now they're out of network. The insurance literally says, we will not cover anything. It is out of network. It is all 100% on you. A PPO, they're a little more lenient. They're a little more helpful. They say, we prefer these providers. If it's not in network, they might cover a percentage of it. But it's definitely not going to be the same amount of savings as if you went to an in-network provider. And some things they just don't cover. They just decide, we're not covering chiropractic. We're not covering hearing aids. And different plans pick on different things. Sometimes if it's like, I work with self-funded plans. So if it's costing the employer a lot for hearing aids, maybe they have a bunch of people, they might just choose not to cover it because now it's too expensive. If only one or two people are utilizing the benefit, they might cover it. It's very literally an employer can just pick anything they want and say, I want to cover this. I don't want to cover this. And that's just the way it is. And that's why it's so hard to pick a plan. That's why your doctor doesn't know what plan you have, because there are just an infinite number of plans out there that they have no way of knowing.
Right, right. And that's another thing to really be clear on too, is that you can have the same insurance company. I'll just use Blue Cross because that's what we've had for years. But one employer might have one set of benefits, but then another employer might have a completely different set of benefits. So it's not like Blue Cross covers this or that or whatever. It's whoever is, I guess, sponsoring the plan. That might be, I guess, a way to put it, but whoever your plan is through, like your employer.
Yeah. Think of Blue Cross as kind of like the manager of it a little bit. So your employer picks all the benefits. I want this, I want that, I don't want to cover that. Here's the benefit. And Blue Cross says, okay, great, and makes it happen. They're not the ones deciding it unless you go to the marketplace and pick a Blue Cross Blue Shield plan. So yeah, it can get really confusing. And so this kind of goes into the other thing we wanted to talk about is, how do you know if it's covered or not? If you have a chronic illness, you know what you need, you know what meds you're on, you know everything that you're on, and you need to take your little list of papers, go to your HR and say, I'm on this med, is it covered? Right? Because sometimes it might be a non-preferred brand, so they're going to try to switch you to a preferred, or you're going to pay a higher copay. Okay, well, I want the one where my most important medication is a preferred drug. Okay, well, that's these few plans. Okay, is chiropractic covered and how much? Well, that plan covers only 12 chiropractic visits, but the one where you have to pay a little more covers 24, and the copay, is $50. So it really becomes like you have to figure out what it is and what's worth paying for, and what you're going to use more, and what benefit you're going to use. If you don't use 24 chiropractics and you only go once a month, then the 12 chiropractic visit appointments might be okay, and because you want the lower copay on your medication.
Right. Right. And I know this last year when we were choosing our insurance, I can't remember where Scott found it, but there was a calculator, an online calculator where you could put in like how many different kinds of visits, how much you spent on each kind of thing. And then it would tell you which was the cheaper option overall.
That's awesome.
Yeah, which was good. And I'll be honest, it came up, I use a lot of healthcare because of all my chiropractic visits and just all the things. And I didn't want to go with a lower plan, even though overall technically it was going to be cheaper. The thought of having that lower plan where I might run out of benefits or have it, I don't know, just that safety net, I guess.
Mhm.
When you have a chronic illness, you just don't know what's going to happen. Even though my fibro's in remission, it's like, you just don't know.
You just don't know. And then you're like, oh, like I have 2 plans that I picked through. I have the plan that I'm going through, and then there's another option. Well, the other option has like this no limit to a hospital visit. So if you were in a hospital, I would have to
Mm,
pay my entire $7,000 to $8,000 out of pocket max in one visit. And that seemed too scary. Not that I have not used that much healthcare compared to like previous years, but I was like, it is not a risk I'm willing to take because as soon as I go down a plan, I'm going to need it. And I just
right,
don't want to deal with that. I want to
right.
be safe.
Yeah. Now, are there things like supplemental plans? Like, let's say, for instance, the person listening who is like, Tammy talks about chiropractic and acupuncture and things like that a lot, but it's just not covered under my plan. Are there options for people to get like a supplement to that?
This is
I,
the second time that's come up kind of. So I'm not entirely sure, but I know you can have a secondary plan, right? So if I have insurance and then my husband has insurance, I can go on his insurance as well, and then it would be secondary. So it's possible to be on your employer's insurance and your spouse's employer's insurance, knowing that one is secondary. And sometimes that helps with copays. Like if your plan isn't covering it all, the other plan will kind of kick in and cover some of it. And that would be the same for like chiropractic visits. I haven't found out if you just can go onto the marketplace and get a new insurance, like get a secondary insurance. I imagine you could. Um, you know, someone asked me if you could like get like a secondary insurance for like specialty medications if your plan
mm,
doesn't cover a specialty.
right.
It has to be there has to be an option out there somewhere. I'm not familiar with it, but I know that having two insurances is a thing.
Yes, yes. I remember that actually as a kid. Both my
Yeah.
parents were teachers, and so sometimes, they'd what one wouldn't cover, the other one did. So,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So the big thing is to really figure out what you use
Yes.
and how that is covered under the insurance plans that you're looking at. I
Hmm.
know with medications, particularly the fibro meds, like it was a long time before there was a generic for Lyrica. A
Hmm.
long time.
Hmm.
And so it was one of those that you didn't have an option of getting a generic because it didn't
Hmm.
exist. So it
Hmm.
was always name brand, and that one was always an expensive medication.
Hmm.
But looking at your insurance to see, is this just not covered?
Hmm.
Is this covered maybe on a different tier? I know
Hmm.
many of the plans we've had have had different tiers for
Yeah.
medications, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so just a little bit about tiers. Tier 1 is usually generic, it's the cheapest tier. Tier 2 is preferred brands. This is the plan that they want you to take. They want to it usually has to do with rebates, to be honest. Like they get a rebate if they do this specific brand. Tier 3 is non-preferred brands. We don't really want you to get this brand. It's not really on formulary, but if you insist that it must be taken, we'll allow it. You just have a higher copay. And then tier 4 is specialty, your biologics, your chemo medications, anything that needs to be through a specialty pharmacy.
mhm.
And these, like you said, like, Lyrico is probably a tier 3 for a really long time on a lot of plans, and they didn't really want to cover it. And there's other similar meds, and you're like, no, there's not. And then you're arguing with insurance companies. Something that can really help with copays is something called copay cards. So manufacturers give patients copay cards. So say you're like, I really need this drug, it's a tier 3 and I have to pay $125 a month. That seems like that's gonna add up. You can get a copay card. They usually have about a $100 to $200 limit depending on the drug, and that they'll lower your copay down to 5, 10, or $25 depending on the medication. A really big one right now is actually if you're on Ozempic or Mounjaro, they have copay cards that if you are paying $100, it will lower it down to $25. And so essentially what it is the manufacturer saying, hey, we know your copay could be kind of high. Let us help you so you can keep taking our drug. Um, so that works. And then if your drug is not covered, There's something called a patient assistance program, and these are programs also through the manufacturer where if your plan is not covering the medication, you can take that denial letter, fill out an application, and send it to the manufacturer, and you can be, reviewed for a patient assistance program. They are financial based, but some of them are like 500% the federal poverty level, which is for like a family of 1 to 2 is about $100,000. So if you make less than $100,000 for you and your spouse, these are some really good options if the plan isn't covering it. Being like, I love this plan, it covers everything I want except my Humira. You can try to apply for a patient assistance for the Humira, and then still
Mhm.
get your medication.
Right.
It's a
Right.
gamble, but
Yeah. Yeah. But it's worth trying. I had a
yes,
client who did that actually for Lyrica
yeah,
before there was a generic.
yeah.
Yep. So, and she got it covered for, I think they approved it for a year for her or something like that. So,
Yep. Yep, it's usually for a year and then you gotta re-enroll, but same with the
mhm.
prior authorization, right? You gotta redo that process every year.
Right. So let's talk about that
Yeah,
because
okay.
since you brought it up, because there's a lot of things. I'll just use my own example, right? I've talked
Mhm,
about the fact that I get Botox for migraines. That is an expensive thing. It's a couple
mhm,
$1,000s if I were to pay for all of it out of
mhm,
pocket.
mhm,
I use uh, a savings card
mhm,
that where they cover part of that.
mhm.
But I also have to have authorization from the insurance company before they will cover it. So let's talk
Yes.
about that.
So prior authorization is put in place to try and kind of it's usually a cost savings method, to be honest,
Mhm.
right? They wanna make sure you're using the drug right, specifically, again, bringing up Ozempic because that's the big thing right now. Everyone wants Ozempic for weight loss. Ozempic is not FDA approved for weight loss, and so they're costing employers, especially self-funded employer, thousands and thousands of dollars a year for a drug that's for an indication that's not FDA approved.
Mhm.
So what they do is they require a prior authorization, and this is a way to limit quantity. So like Imitrex for migraines, you only can get 9. So they require a prior authorization, and they only approve it for a quantity of 9 per month. Migraine meds is a big one, erectile dysfunction meds, GLP-1s, and Ozempic, Mounjaro are one, and also like Botox. Botox, generally, when people first think of Botox, a lot of people think of it as cosmetic. Like you
Yep.
want Botox to get rid of your wrinkles. Most plans don't cover cosmetic agents. So if you're using it for something that's not a cosmetic agent, you need to show medical proof that it's being used not to just smooth out your wrinkles, but for legitimate medical reason. So they have a prior authorization. And that's basically your doctor has probably complained about it, your pharmacy, everyone has probably complained about it. No one really likes prior authorizations. They're the reason that stops you from getting your med at the pharmacy. It's a necessary evil. And the best thing you can do is just learn about it and figure out what you need to provide so you can provide it right away. Whenever you have a new plan, whenever it's a new year, you usually need a new prior authorization. So for these prior authorizations, they usually want your diagnosis code. They want to know what else you've tried. They want to know if it's working. So when you've been on it, they want to know like, yes, this is providing adequate relief or adequate relief that really it's working and they're not just paying for it even though you're still getting migraines.
Mhm.
Um,
I know I had to submit a headache log that
yeah,
showed, before I was approved, I had to show that I had a certain number of migraine days a month. And then
yes.
after I got it the first time, we had to submit a log to show that it actually helped. So, yeah.
Yes. Yes, and so if you are ever wondering what the prior authorizations for your medication are, you can just very easily Google it. One, you could always ask the person, but if you just don't want to talk to someone and just want to Google it, type in your drug name and say prior authorization requirements, and a whole bunch of different plans will come up and different requirements will come up. And that's kind of how you can get a good idea of what you need to see if you've met them. Some plans are more strict, some plans are more lenient. And so your specific plan will vary. But it's a good idea sometimes, you can see what the requirements are beforehand.
Right. Just to know what you need to do. I
Yeah.
mean, right, with a headache log, if you find out at the last minute you need that and you haven't been tracking your headaches,
Right.
right?
Yes. Yeah. It just
Yeah.
kind of gives you a heads up. Then when you go to your doctor, you have your appointment and you're like, hey, this needs a prior authorization. Once you have insurance, you can also just call your insurance and just say, what's the prior authorization requirements for this med? And they should be able to let you know all of that. And that way you can take it to your doctor. So that way you don't have to, well, we need X, Y, and Z. So come back in a month. And now you have another provider copay to pay. If you just get that all taken care of and do your due diligence and kind of bring that to them and say they want to know X, Y, and Z, will you make sure you put that on the form? Makes your doctor's life a little easier, makes your life easier, you get the med quicker.
Absolutely. Because of course your doctor is not going to be able to know what your plan is,
Right.
right? Because as we've discussed, even if you have a particular, your insurance is through a particular company, the options are infinite.
Yes. Yes. And even having a prior authorization doesn't always mean that it's going to be covered. Some plans just refuse to cover Botox for whatever reason. They just say, nope, we're not covering it. It's an injection given in the doctor's office. It's not a pharmacy benefit covered under medical. And then medical is insistent that it's a pharmacy benefit. That's another big thing that can happen is if it's an infusion given in a doctor's office, it's usually covered under medical. And if it's a medication, if it's given like subcutaneously, like you give it to an injection you give at your house, that's usually pharmacy. And sometimes there's a battle between who's going to cover it. It tends to be cheaper under the pharmacy benefit just because the drug itself is under the pharmacy benefit. But then they're like, no, we don't cover infusions. And so there's that we deal with that sometimes. That's a big back and forth. And so again, if you are on infusion, you want to make sure you say, is this covered? Is this covered under medical or pharmacy? And if it's covered under medical, okay, what are the infusion costs? What are the infusion copay versus what would be my copay picking up at the pharmacy? Those can be different.
And another thing I noticed with my Botox is that the Botox itself, it comes from a specialty pharmacy, so I have to pay the pharmacy. But then in the doctor's office, I have the regular doctor's office visit copay,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
then I have a coinsurance for the procedure of actually doing the injections.
Yes. So
Yeah.
and the procedure and the office visit are covered under medical, but because you're picking it up at the pharmacy, that's your pharmacy benefit in play.
Crazy.
It's just so like there's just so many things in play. There's so many moving parts to it. I There are still things that I don't understand and I work in it every day. Then you also get like durable medical equipment.
Mm,
Sometimes your glucose monitoring system is covered under pharmacy. Sometimes it's completely excluded and only through your DME. It's crazy.
it is.
It
Which
is.
is why we're doing this episode,
Yes.
because the average person out there is not necessarily going to understand all these little nuances,
Right.
right? So, can we talk a little bit about the exchange? Because about half of fibro patients are actually on disability, which means
Mhm,
they might be using an insurance plan like, the state healthcare or
mhm,
Medicaid or something like that, where they're
mhm.
actually getting their insurance on the exchange.
Yeah, so the exchange open enrollment is usually in December and then it starts 1/1, and that is like you just have a whole bunch of plans that you kind of look up and you can compare plans and there's just like it seems like an infinite number of plans. My experience with exchange, what I did like about it is you can literally look up your provider and say, I have this provider. I want a plan that this provider is in network, and we'll give you all of the plans that that provider is in network. That's kind of nice because your employer's plan is going to be your employer plans. They're going to pick 4 to 6 for you, right? And they're gonna say pick one. Healthcare, you just have like an infinite number. There's like silver, gold, bronze. I think they just standardized some of it recently. I'm not entirely sure. But that it's through this website, and it's a little easier to kind of find, make sure your doctor's in network.
Right, right, because you have all the plans to choose from, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I will say with that, that if you find that all incredibly overwhelming, which it can be, right? On one hand, it's good. You've got lots of options. On the other hand, it's overwhelming because you have lots of
Hmm.
options, right?
Yes.
What can be helpful is finding an insurance broker, particularly in
Yes.
your state, because they are licensed that way. But if
Hmm.
you can find somebody to kind of sift through all of that, and they'll be able to know a little bit more about, is this a good company to work with, or
Right.
are they late in making, claims payments and things like that,
Yeah.
and to be able to kind of sift through that with you. So,
Yeah, because there can be different plans. You can see Blue Cross Blue Shield, Blue Care Network, Aetna, like all of these other things. I'm not even like familiar with all of them, right? I always just went for Blue Cross Blue Shield because I knew I used a lot of healthcare, and Blue Cross Blue Shield tends to be very well known and pretty good
most people
coverage.
take it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so right, it's very well taken, right? It's usually in network. You have a lot of doctors that will take it. Some of them are really complex. They're going to fight you for everything, and so every time you want to get coverage, it's a battle. But if you like, I like the suggestion. If you have a broker, find a broker. They're going to have some tips and tricks for you. They're going to kind of know if you say, "Hey, I want this." They're looking at the plans all day, every day, so they're kind of know where to go, what to look for, what options to look for, which plans might have that. Um, so the biggest thing I can say is get help, because sometimes what happens is a member comes to me and they say, "I want this drug," and I say it's not covered. And then the doctor calls me all mad. "Well, what are the alternatives?" And I just say, "This plan doesn't cover specialty." And at that point, there's nothing I can do. And it's the only thing I can really say is pick a different plan, right? You really need to know your medicine. You really need to know what benefits you specifically need, and you have to pick a plan off of that. You can't just pick the cheapest plan expecting, "Oh, I have health insurance, it's going to cover everything." That's not how it works. If you pick the cheapest plan, it's like catastrophic, right? Like, okay, if I'm in the hospital, I won't go bankrupt, but I'm still going to be paying could be paying like $20,000. I've seen maximum out of pocket and deductibles being. So you really just need to take your benefits, go find a broker, go talk to your HR guy and say, "This is what I need. Which plan best fits this?"
I love that. I love that. So, for you listening, the best thing you can do right now is start gathering that information together.
Mm.
Right? Start
Yes.
figuring out how many times do you go to your primary care? How many specialist visits do you have? Like your neurologist, in my case, we've been talking
Hmm.
about Botox,
Hmm.
right? Sometimes there's a separate thing for specialists. Do you have chiropractic coverage? Do you wish you had chiropractic
Hmm.
coverage, right? Like think about the
Hmm.
things that you might use if they were covered, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
add that to your list and figure out what meds you take and
Hmm.
all of that kind of stuff so that when the time comes to choose, you've got the information that you need.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Now, one other thing I wanted us to talk about, and you brought this up earlier too,
Hmm.
is, when claims are denied. You did an
Hmm.
awesome class for our coaches talking
Yeah.
about how we as coaches can help our clients get these
Hmm.
claims approved. But let's just share a couple of tips for everybody now, because that seems to be a real headache and a real process for a lot of us.
Yes. Yes. So again, prior authorization, you go to the pharmacy, you go to pick up your med, and your doctor says, or the pharmacy says, "We're waiting on prior authorization from your doctor." First and foremost, a lot of it is dependent on your doctor. Sometimes you have a great doctor and a not so great office staff. I'm sorry. I wish there was things that I could do for that. Just sometimes they just have a bad office staff. doctor's
Yes, I
overworked.
hear
Okay.
that so often, actually. The doctor was great, but the person making the appointment or, when I call in, they're not nice to me.
Yeah, and they're usually the ones doing the prior authorizations,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate. However, there is like cover my meds, so you can kind of just say it's cover my meds. So what I would say is if you know your drug needs a prior authorization, go to the doctor and in the visit say, I know this needs a prior authorization. Can we do this right now? Sometimes there's a form that needs to be filled out. You can call your person, like your insurance company, and say, I'm on this drug. I think it needs a prior authorization. What are the prior authorization requirements? What does the doctor need to fill out? They can probably send you a blank. There's usually like a PA form, prior authorization form, that needs to be filled out. Um, Common drugs that need PA forms: migraine meds, erectile dysfunction meds, specialty meds, so your biologics, your injections. Um, Recently, GLP-1 agonist, which is the diabetic med. Um, that's a lot of what we see. Sometimes seizure meds, and also opioids. Opioids are
Like
usually
for
allowed
the
in.
heavier duty ones might need
Yeah,
prior authorization.
yeah, they're
Tramadol
usually.
might not, but
Yeah, right, right. Tramadol might not, but like if you're on oxycodone or fentanyl, they'll usually allow a 14-day supply. But if you need a 30-day supply because you're in chronic pain and you've been on it for many years,
Mhm.
it usually needs a prior authorization along with like the opioid questions. Make sure your doctor, with the opioids, I always say tell your doctor to send in the opioid contract that you probably had to sign. They have to like confirm that they checked on Michigan, it's the MAP system, the prescription drug monitoring system. Make sure they told you about abuse and the possibility and the side effects and Narcan. Um, so prior authorizations is usually the hardest part. I would not imagine it would be done in a day. So be nice to your pharmacy when they say it's not back yet, it's not back yet, it's not their fault. So essentially what happens is the pharmacy runs the drug claim rejects for a prior authorization needed. The pharmacy lets the doctor know. The doctor has to has to complete and send the PA form to the insurance company. The insurance company has usually a pharmacist, right, which is what I do, looks at the prior authorization and compares it to PA guidelines. So it's not like there's someone over there who's like, ha ha ha, I'm going to deny this med, right? That never feels good. It doesn't feel good to deny you your medication. And also, there are strict requirements that we need to do. Maybe the plan requires 3 alternatives that you have to try. Okay, well, I was on a plan before and it only covered one. I'm so sorry. This plan requires that you have tried 3. So there are just certain requirements that they have to be met. They're either met or not. And if they are, then they approve it. They have to put in the prior authorization. And sometimes they'll call the pharmacy and say, hey, the prior authorization is approved. I know we try to do that. We call them, make sure the pharmacy gets a paid claim, and then you'll get a text that it's ready. So to you, it looks like the pharmacy's doing some back end stuff, but it's like some back end stuff. Like your doctor needs to fill out this form that goes to insurance company that no one even knows who it is, that then completes the PA guidelines, make sure you have met all the requirements, and then makes a decision whether or not to approve it.
And that, of course, isn't taking into consideration the piles and piles of other people's like when things come to you, I'm sure like the second it comes in, you're not, stamping yes or no on it, right? Like there's
Right.
a queue, right? There's a
There there's a
list.
there's a queue. We get times when like a patient will call us and say, we want to start a prior authorization. We say, okay, great. We send it to the doctor. They don't answer. We send it again. They don't answer. We send it again. They don't answer. They don't answer. We send it again. And then they don't answer. And then they call a week later. Well, I'm calling to check on the status of my prior authorization. We're like, okay, but you have to send in the forms for us to be able to even
Right.
look at it. So there's a queue. Like, it's a lot. It's a lot.
It's yeah.
And the best thing you can do is be prepared. So if you know you're getting a new insurance company, you take opioids, make sure you let your doctor know, hey, my insurance company is changing. Can we start the prior authorization as soon as possible? Because the prior authorization can be put in place before you actually need a refill. I think that's the worst sometimes is, sometimes people don't know like their
Mhm.
insurance changed a little bit and then suddenly they're out of meds, they didn't request the refill earlier enough and they're like it was just a rough month, And now they're like, okay, I need my refill. And then they're like, okay, you need a prior authorization. And it's usually going to be about a week for that process, for the doctor to send it out, for the doctor to get it back into the insurance company to review it.
Right. Right. And, we're talking about pharmacy meds because, of course, that's
Yeah.
your world. But this
Yeah.
does apply to procedures and things too. I mean, I've
Yes.
had clients who are often various injections, like trigger point
Hmm.
injections or neck injections or
Hmm.
hip
SI
injections or
injections. Yeah.
low back injections. There can be procedures as well, MRIs, right?
Yeah. Yes, and that is same thing, right? Your doctor needs to send over an authorization to that, so that's good to know too. If you know you're someone who gets SI injections or steroid injections or any type of injections, and that's a common thing for you, make sure you figure it out. I know there has been people who come to the appointment and then don't get it done because their insurance didn't authorize it, or they decided to book it for the beginning of the year and they hadn't met their deductible, and suddenly it's going to be $1,500 because they have to meet their deductible.
Right.
My
Right.
dog came to join us. Hi, Lucy. So what
She's
me?
such a cutie.
Hey.
We're gonna have to have you
Oh,
back to talk about service dogs at some point.
oh, definitely, definitely. She's precious. Best thing ever. Right, Lucy?
So, Chelsea, anything you want to add? Anything you want to say to the person listening who's like pulling out their hair because of their insurance woes?
Yeah. The biggest thing is whatever you don't like about your insurance company now or your insurance plan now, there's probably a plan that solves that problem. If you don't like that you don't have any chiropractor visits, there's a plan that covers chiropractic. If you don't like any of your employer options, go to the marketplace and get it there. There there is an option. And what I really, really would recommend is take the time to just sit down and figure it out. It will save you a lot of headaches down the road. To just take this time when there's open enrollment and really look at it and really try to figure out what you need. Um, at the end of the day, if your plan doesn't cover something and you keep submitting a prior authorization, there's nothing they can do. And I think that's really like the hardest part as being as someone who reviews prior authorizations is having to say, there's nothing I can do for you. Pick a different plan. Like at the end of the day, right? A lot of the insurance people just say you have to pick the plan that's best for you. And if you know you're on a specialty life saving medication, make sure your plan covers and will pay for this life saving medication. Um, I, no one else can know that except for you. And you just have to be an advocate for your own health and you have to speak up and you have to be willing to say, I'm on this medication. Is this covered?
Right. Right. And, it can be very confusing. There can be lots of options. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask questions,
Right.
whoever you're getting your insurance through, a broker, those kinds of things. As coaches, I wish I could say that this was something we could help you with, but other than just kind of talking through options with you,
Yeah.
we don't know, like we can't know every state and every
Right.
option every employer has. So, but
Yeah.
when it comes to those prior authorizations and some of those kinds of things, there are things that we can do, even if it's just keeping you accountable and, reminding you of the things that need to be done when.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And so, I mean, if you have the SBC, print out all of that and you want to take that to your coach, they can probably help you look at it. When you're looking at all the numbers on your own, it gets really overwhelming really quick. And so, when you have someone, an objective party out there, they're like, okay, well, would you be able to pay this? And they can kind of just reframe it in a way that might be easier for you to understand in that moment. Um,
mhm.
but really, you have to be your own advocate and you have to know what you need and you have to be willing to ask for what you need. And if you don't get it, ask someone because figuring it out now will serve you in the long run as opposed to picking the wrong plan and then not being able to get the help you need.
Right. Because as we said at the beginning, you can only switch during these open enrollment periods. unless you
Right.
have some major thing happen, getting married, getting divorced, having a
Right.
baby, like these life-changing events, then you can reassess your insurance. But most of us are not going to be having that happen
Right.
regularly. So this is your
Hopefully.
chance to choose, and then you're locked in till next year.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for all of this and for sharing your
Yes.
expertise and the behind the scenes. I think this will be
Happy to
really
help.
helpful for lots of people.
Good. I'm happy to help. Thank you for having me.
And that wraps up my interview with Dr. Chelsea Liebowitz. Now, as Dr. Chelsea and I were wrapping up, after I stopped the recording, we realized there was a couple of things that we meant to mention and didn't. So I want to share those with you now. First of all, if insurance does not cover a particular medication or a particular procedure, you can still get that medication or that procedure. You just typically will have to pay for it yourself. So, for example, if your insurance doesn't cover a particular medication, you would just go to the pharmacy. They would give you the retail cash price and you would pay that. I also remembered that there have been a few times where the cash price at a drugstore was actually cheaper than the insurance price. So, for example, there was a medication that I needed, and I just went to Costco and paid their regular Costco price. And that was actually cheaper than what it would have been at my regular drugstore at my insurance price. So, if you do have something expensive, you can shop around and see what options you might have. Another option along these lines is using a GoodRx coupon. You can go to goodrx.com. We'll have that link on today's show notes page, and you can get a coupon that will give you a discount at your pharmacy. And so sometimes that, again, can be a cheaper option than what it might cost you with your insurance. Another thing to take a look at is that sometimes drugstores will have certain medications on a special price. So I know for a while, this was years ago now, but for a while Walgreens had $4 for a list of medications, things, real common generic ones like blood pressure medications or, cholesterol medications. And it was only $4. It was cheaper to go that route than to get it on your insurance. So definitely check around and see, particularly if you have some of those very common generic medications, just see what the cash price is. It might be better than your insurance price. Also, keep in mind that you can shop around for that cash price. So it's just like buying anything else out there. It's not necessarily the same price at every store. If they take your insurance and you're getting it on insurance, that will probably be the same. But once you get into where you're paying the co-insurance, where you pay 20%, for example, and insurance pays 80%, that price may or may not be the same at every drugstore. So definitely check that out and go grab that GoodRx coupon. That can also be used for your pets. You guys know about my cat, Sam. He was on many different medications, and we used the GoodRx coupon to get his medications at a lower price. Now I've got this week's listener shout out for you. This one comes from Katie in Oregon. She says, I went to the screening you hosted in Portland. That was of the film Invisible. And she says, I was so happy to have a sense of community I haven't had before with other fibro warriors. Thank you so much for coming to the screening, Katie, and for sending us your little note. We really appreciate hearing about that. It was a special night, wasn't it? Now, for those of you who haven't had a chance to watch the fibromyalgia documentary, Invisible, it is now available on Amazon Prime. So if you're here in the U.S., you can go out there, you can rent it and watch it now. And we are working, of course, on getting it in other locations as well. So it's worth going out and checking to see if it's available where you are. We don't have total control over that, but we are working to do what we can to get that in all the places where you guys can watch this. But just go to Amazon Prime. We'll have a link in today's show notes where you can rent it if you're here in the U.S. Again, today's show notes page is fibromyalgiapodcast.com/111 for episode 111. And we will have all those links out there for you. The last thing I wanted to mention before we wrap up today, we are gearing up for our next Stories of Hope and Healing event. This is the event that I hold twice a year where I interview live some of our graduates on specifically what have they done over the last few months to improve their fibromyalgia. And they share a little bit of their story. They share with you some of the things that they've done. Of course, we share excerpts of that here on the podcast. But if you'd like to attend the event live, hear the whole thing, then I invite you to join us. It will be on Saturday, July 22nd, and we will have all the details again on today's show notes page, fibromyalgiapodcast.com/111. See you here next time.